Hey everyone, Dr. Rob here. I want to take a moment to spotlight my sponsors, Professional Co-op, empowering clinicians with premium access to top-tier lab services at a fraction of the cost. Since 2001, Professional Co-op has redefined what efficient, patient-centered support should look like. No hidden fees, no minimums, and you only pay for completed tests. It's lab access made simple, transparent, and affordable. Trusted by licensed healthcare professionals across the country, Professional Co-op is your strategic partner in delivering high-quality care. Discover more at www.professionalco-op.com. A quick shout out to my other sponsor, Functional Medicine University, one of the top online programs for learning functional medicine. Founded by Dr. Ron Grisanti, FMU has trained thousands of healthcare professionals in over 50 states and over 68 countries. It's completely online, self-paced, and CE approved for a wide range of clinicians, MDs, DCs, NDs, PAs, and more. At the end of the program, you earn your certified functional medicine practitioner credential, something that's truly elevated my clinical approach. If you're ready to level up your practice with evidence-based root cause care, FMU is the place to start. Check them out at functionalmedicineuniversity.com. As a practitioner, I only use products I believe in, and Nutridyne is at the top of that list. What I love about Nutridyne is their unwavering commitment to quality, transparency, and science. Their products are practitioner exclusive, which means they're built specifically for clinical use. And that matters when you're trying to get real results. From foundational support to condition-specific protocols, I've seen firsthand the difference Nutridyne makes in my patient's health and in my practice. Hey everybody, Dr. Rob here, Proven Health Alternatives. I have Dr. Austin Perlmutter here, and we are going to light the world on fire, or hopefully light your brain on fire. So before we dig in, let me just say hi, Dr. Perlmutter. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back. Excited to have the conversation.
Always great to converse with you. You always illuminate me with some of your leading edge responses and thoughts. And let's just dig in. Well, we want to talk about longevity. So, what does longevity mean to you? And what does the current movement of focus on longevity get right and wrong?
Longevity basically means duration of lifespan. So longevity means having a long life. Now, there are certain things that are within that conversation which relate to what specifically that long life represents. There has been an absolute explosion in recent years of brands and conversation around longevity. And I've never seen anything like this in terms of the amount of public interest in a topic and how many brands are emerging in multi-billion dollar valuations that are focused on this idea of prolonging lifespan, so promoting longevity. I love the idea of being interested in health in any way, shape, and form. The reality of it is right now in the United States, 60+% of people have one chronic disease and 40+% have two or more. We have rampant levels of metabolic dysfunction, immune dysfunction, and so much of this is preventable. But in order for us to prevent this, it's not just changing the infrastructure of the American healthcare system, it's also empowering people to be excited about doing something to promote their health. And so longevity is part of that. I see so many people who have never really before cared about their health saying, hey, I've been hearing about longevity. I heard this podcast. I read this book. And that is wonderful. I love that aspect of it. But the flip side of this is that there is a tendency to go towards things that either are not super science based or are not all that helpful, because the reality of it is that I don't know about you, but I don't want to live to 100 to 120 if my health sucks. I don't want to simply be present with my
Right.
brain not functioning. So it's not just about living a long life, it's about having a healthy life, a quality life. So instead of just longevity, I'm focused on health span. And the second thing I'll just say here, which I'm sure we'll get into, is when we look at what we actually know we can do, there's very little data showing that we can prolong lifespan in humans with most of the interventions that are very popular right now. But what we can do is actually slow the rate of aging within our cells, within our organs, and in doing so, dramatically prolong and extend health span for those organs and for our overall quality of life. So I've been particularly focused on health span for the brain, not just how long we live, but the quality of those years for the brain, because I think that is what drives the actual thing we care about most, which is enjoying the lives that we have for the most that we can with the time that we have allocated. So longevity, wonderful as an opener to get people interested in health, but there's so much more when you start to go underneath the iceberg as it relates to both what is science-based and what we can do about it.
Outstanding. I wholeheartedly agree with you. Longevity, lifespan versus health span. We both want to push it up and parallel them together. I'm a little bit more about vitality, but that really speaks to what you're talking about, vitality and brain. Real exciting topic. Most people look at the brain and they, if you will, they take it for granted. Interestingly enough, the way you're looking at it, health span and brain, most people look at it like you started with the chronic disease. The average American lives to about 77.5 years. They have pretty good health span until about 66.1. So if you do the math, it's the last 18%. Not a good thing. Alzheimer's comes to mind, sixth leading cause of death. So really begs the question, Austin, health span, brain, where are we going to go with this?
I want to highlight that because the reality of it is we are living decades longer than our ancestors 100 years ago. In the Paleolithic age, people lived to around 30, 33 years old. I mean, largely because they had different threats than what we have now. But you're right, people are living now into their 70s, 80s, some of them into their 90s. But statistically speaking, if you get to these higher ages, your risk for having these problems in your health that are preventable go up exponentially. And what we're seeing is kind of a progression downwards of many of these conditions happening at younger and younger ages. But let's just say you live to age 65, which I hope all of us do. Your risk for having diabetes is 29%, and risk for prediabetes is 49%. If you live to age 55 or above, your lifetime risk for developing dementia is 42%. And just from kind of a functional perspective, if you live to age 75, your risk for having arthritis, which obviously can be debilitating in terms of being able to move around, is over 50%. So my goal here is to say, look, the body changes as we go on in years, and some of this is preventable, some of it is not, but we can do so much to protect and enhance the health of the parts of our body that we know we're able to intervene on. And so, as it relates to the brain, the brain does change over time. There's no getting around this. Some of this is for the better. We want to learn. We want to change day to day. Some of this may be for the worse if we look at risk for dementia and for some of these other brain-related issues. What you see is, though, that the brain undergoes this spectrum of change over the lifespan. So in the prenatal period and through kind of early childhood, we see a transition from neurogenesis, which is the creation of lots of neurons, through to something called neuronal pruning. So basically, we make a lot of neurons, and then we create a lot of connections between those neurons, and then we start pruning the connections to create the brains that are going to sustain us into adulthood. What you see across the adult stages of brain function is that some data suggests peak cognitive performance is actually in young adulthood. And then by the time we get to around middle adulthood, we have a peaking in crystallized intelligence, but we may have a decline in certain cognitive functions. And most importantly, what we see later in life is a general decline in our total brain volume. So this would be brain atrophy. We see impairments in neuroplasticity. We see changes in the brain's immune system. We see changes in the brain's metabolic state. And all of this correlates with impaired brain function. One of the most powerful kind of correlates here is that impairments in brain immune state and impairments in brain metabolic state correlate with risk for dementia and age-related cognitive decline. So what I'm talking about here is the full continuum of our brains over our lifespans. And while certainly we want to worry about dementia, we don't want to develop dementia. Obviously, if we can prevent it, I'm talking about the overall state of brain longevity, specifically brain health span or brain span, because it's not just about avoiding Alzheimer's, which, yes, I love to avoid Alzheimer's. I've had two grandparents with Alzheimer's disease, but it's also about how your mind works and not just can you remember things, but how's your mental health? How do you feel when you wake up in the day? These are reflections of brain state. And so the brain becomes this microcosm of everything we're learning about longevity research when you consider how the microbiome influences the brain, the vagus nerve influences the brain, how stress, how air pollution all impacts the brain. My principal goal is to help people protect their brain function over their lifespan. And the great news here is because the brain is so conscious of and sensitive of all of these different variables around us because the brain is made up of 80 billion neurons and 80 billion glial cells, and because those cells are incredibly responsive to the environment, we always have an opportunity to enhance and protect our brains. This isn't something where we get to a certain part of our lives and there's nothing that can be done. The exact opposite is true. Every moment of every day is an opportunity to vote for a healthier brain now and for the rest of your life. And the most important things that you can do to protect your brain and to enhance your brain function are not pharmaceutical and they're not procedural when you think about the long-term benefits. It's all about lifestyle. And it's all about the choices we make right now.
That was excellent. I got to tell you, you're really talking about microglial cells when you're talking about the immune function in the brain. So I'm jumping the gun a little for you, but you really highlighted the idea of lifestyle, how it affects brain health. So everybody's going to ask me, because this is what my followers want. Okay, I'm with you. I want my brain to function well. What lifestyle hacks or lifestyle changes do I need to make to keep my brain functioning optimally?
Yeah, well, what we're learning from the research is that, like any other part of your body, your brain ages in response to environmental programming. And one of the pathways that seems to be most at play is the aging of your neurons and the aging of your glial cells. Now, you alluded to one of those glial cells called a microglial cell. It's the brain's immune cell. Makes up roughly 15 to 20 billion cells in your brain, so a huge percentage of your total brain cells. And we know that lifestyle has a dramatic effect on these microglial cells, and we know that lifestyle has a dramatic effect on our overall brain state. So there are many things that can be done. We can go into each of those in detail. But I kind of bucket the interventions from a lifestyle perspective as those things that interact on your brain's immune state, those things that interact with your brain's metabolic state, and those things that interact with neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. And so some of the top variables, some of the top levers that you can pull to slow your rate of brain aging and to protect your brain will be dietary, will be sleep, will be specifically the air pollution. We'll talk about that in a moment, but the things that we inhale will be psychological stress mitigation. Another is trauma. So I'm not talking here necessarily about psychological trauma, even though we know that's also something that has an impact, but physical trauma, meaning banging up your skull and in doing so damaging your brain, is a massive preventable lifestyle variable that is correlated with worse brain health and brain aging. Physical activity, of course. And then we're learning about some other variables that may have a role to play in terms of helping to mitigate the effects of brain aging. But most of these things are lifestyle modifications that people are aware of. What makes this interesting to me is that the data are now very clear as to how different lifestyle variables influence different pathways within the brain. Sleep, for example, seems to program the brain's immune system towards a state of balance and promote neuroplasticity and help form new memories and help to improve what's called glymphatic flux. So, this waste system within our brains. Exercise, which we've historically thought about as important because it's a cardiovascular intervention, turns out to be key in production of molecules called myokines. These are signals produced by our muscles that when they enter into the brain, they can actually help to regulate inflammation, enhance neuroplasticity, and boost metabolic balance. So there's a lot to be said in terms of saying, well, we know exercise is good for the body. What do we do for the brain? it turns out it's maybe far more nuanced than we once believed, but the outcomes from that become very practical for most people. So we can talk a little bit more about the specifics, but I'd say those are the big buckets of lifestyle interventions that have been studied to act on pathways related to brain aging.
Excellent. I have to wholeheartedly agree with you. And I got real excited when you talked about concussion. I am going to table that because I want to do a little rapid fire with you. Again, people are looking for these tangible takeaways. So I'm going to ask you for the brain, what do you prefer, fat or carbohydrates?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that with an absolute. The reality of it is that fats and carbohydrates are too large of classes of nutrients to differentiate into good or bad. I think there's a popular misconception in diet that carbs are bad. There's a popular misconception that fats are either good or bad.
Right.
And there are differences. So if I said you should eat more fats but didn't tell you about trans fats, you could have a really bad time. If I said carbs are great for you and that included eating a bunch of, I guess, processed sugar, you could have a bad time. So I would say, unfortunately, this isn't a yes or no, carbs or fats. It's certain types of carbs and certain types of fats.
Great answer.
Favorite type of carbohydrate? Fiber, dietary fiber. Why is that the case? It's linked to better brain health. It's linked to longer lifespan. Yes, eating more fiber is linked to living a longer life, which means eating more of a certain type of carbohydrate is a good thing. When it comes to eating the healthiest fats, I'd say what we're landing on is omega-3 fats, pretty consistently studied to be beneficial to overall and to brain health. We could talk about specific subtypes of omega-3 fats, but the bottom line here is it is not this gross avoidance of this macronutrient, which is fat, because we know for a number of reasons, but that the brain is mostly by dry weight made of fat, and that it has an overabundance of omega-3 fats, in particular DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, which is found in cell membranes within the brain. It helps with neuroplasticity. So, no, we don't want to be avoiding those fats. Those are good things from our diets. But to come back to your answer here, it's not fats, it's not carbs. It's questioning, how have we looked at nutrition in terms of absolutes, binaries, fad diets, and moving towards a state of not necessarily an explicit diet that you're going to do for a couple of days and then fall off, which is the typical way people use diet, but rather a lifestyle that incorporates healthy eating habits, which in this case would be rich in healthy fats, omega-3s, polyunsaturated fats, and lower in unhealthy fats, specifically trans fats, with some correlation here, depending on who you are and your kind of fat metabolism abilities with saturated fat.
I love the answer. I really do because everybody asks for those absolutes and you really explain the difference. They're all macronutrients. They all have their place. N equals one, as we both like to discuss. You mentioned exercise. You mentioned cardio. So I kind of know your answer already, but is it better to do cardio or is it better to do weight training for your
Yeah.
brain?
When it comes to protecting your brain and improving your brain, largely this translation of the cardiovascular research over to the brain, it was only somewhat recently that researchers found, in military conscripts that people who tend to do more aerobic exercise tended to have better health. And so we said, oh, well, maybe people need to do more aerobic exercise or cardio exercise, basically rhythmic activity. Think about jogging, for example, because it seems to be good for our bodies. It maybe improves our vascular function. It helps to suppress inflammation. All that stuff is true. It is certainly the case that cardio is good for your brain, and I would definitely not recommend against that. But what I would recommend is that we don't downplay or forget about the role of resistance or weight training. And in some ways, resistance or weight training may be more beneficial to brain health than aerobic conditioning. And the specific reason why that's the case is that when you lift weights, when you put resistance on your muscles, this is when your muscles are most activated. And when your muscles are most activated, it does a couple of things. First, it pulls glucose out of your circulation. A exercising muscle, or when your muscles are all exercising, it can actually pull 80% of your total glucose into muscles in terms of the availability of that glucose in your bloodstream. It doesn't mean you're going to be hypoglycemic, but they can actually use up a ton of that glucose. Why that's a good thing is for most people, they have at least some degree of metabolic dysfunction. This can help to improve circulating glucose levels. It's also linked to improved insulin sensitivity, which is a great thing. The other half of this equation, though, and perhaps even more notable, is that when you exercise your muscles, especially your large skeletal muscles, so we're talking about leg exercises, weighted leg exercises, resistance leg exercises, you produce molecules called myokines. Myokines is a large group of many, many different types of molecules like irisin, cathepsin B. These molecules, some of them can cross the blood-brain barrier, impact the brain's metabolic, immune, and neuroplastic pathways. And what we're seeing here is this may be one of the most powerful ways that we can protect our brains. One of the most popular myokines that have been discussed for a while is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, often described as a miracle grow, something that can boost brain function. So that's great, but that's just one example of the fact that when you do resistance training, especially with your skeletal lower extremity muscles, because that's where your biggest skeletal muscles are, that you're going to be boosting these molecules that can subsequently enhance your brain function. So long story short here is when it comes to exercise for the brain, the answer is always yes. But don't forget about resistance training. Weight training by itself may also be a powerful way to support good brain health.
So to recap, good brain health for longevity and strengthen your immune system in your brain, which is your microglials. Number one, good quality diet with a mix of quality macronutrients, real foods, no ultra processed foods. Clean air, which I know you're going to piggyback on in a moment because I really want to hear your feeling on that. Exercise, a combination of weight resistance for both men and women. It doesn't necessarily have to be overhead Olympic lifting. You'll take regular resistance training, good quality cardiovascular. Well, I know we're going to get into gut health, but I really want to talk to you about the air because 80% of our immune cells are in our gut. And the reason that they're in our gut is because, number one, food is the biggest carnage, but we forget about part of our first line of defense in our immune system, which is our nose.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say one last thing on this. So, again, for people who are concerned about glucose regulation here, skeletal muscle can uptake up to 80% of postprandial glucose, which is an amazing thing as we're looking at this connection between blood sugar and muscle. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight here that you just mentioned, it's not about doing overhead Olympic lifts when we're talking about muscle training. What we're trying to do here is create sustainability. So you can do some leg presses, you can do some body weight exercises, you can use some bands, and there should certainly not be some sort of an unrealistic criteria where women are not supposed to be doing weight training. I think that's been incredibly detrimental because we know that women have a much higher rate of developing brain issues. And so why would we not want women to have access to this powerful tool to improve these myokines to help protect their brains? Moving to this other part of the equation, which is the air component. So I think there's a tendency in wellness culture to over-index towards the sensational and the exciting. And most of the time, what that means is talking a lot about nutrition, talking about this supplement, that nutritional intervention, the newest diet. People love to talk about food and people love to talk about superfoods and individual nutrients that are going to solve all of their problems. This does not mean that food is insignificant. It is the exact opposite. Food matters a lot. But what it does mean is we tend to miss some of the more significant variables that can be major adjuncts to a healthy diet, or in some ways, maybe even more powerful than certain dietary interventions. And the biggest missed opportunity we have to improve our wellness and protect our brains is looking at the quality of the air that we breathe. That's because we breathe on average 20,000 times a day. And when we look at the research on brain health outcomes and air quality, there's no debate that the quality of the air that we breathe is a massive driver of our risk, not just for dementia, but we're now understanding for depression, for anxiety, as well as for aggressive and violent behavior, for worse test taking, for children's neurodevelopmental outcomes. And that's just the tip of the iceberg as it relates to what air does to our brains. And again, majorly miss this. But the publications coming out in journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association and the Lancet, basically the top tier medical journals on earth, are very explicit about this, showing that when we inhale polluted air, it messes with every aspect of our health. And we've seen this for decades as it relates to pulmonary health. It's pretty clear that people who smoke cigarettes have worse health outcomes, specifically that they have higher risk for lung issues like lung cancer, COPD, and also heart issues, heart attacks, heart failure, the whole spectrum of cardiovascular diseases. Well, it turns out that when we breathe polluted air, we're actually being exposed to those same types of molecules. And there is a reason why breathing more polluted air correlates with shortened lifespan, with higher rates of metabolic diseases, with higher rates of immunologic diseases, with microbiome dysbiosis, which we can get into a moment. And there's also a reason why you see these high rates of brain issues with air pollution. So that's kind of the overview as to why we should care. The thing that got me most interested in air pollution in particular is that I learned that in the United States, the majority of the air pollution that a person's being exposed to, this is actually true around the world, but in the United States in particular, is happening inside of our homes because we spend 90 plus percent of our day in our cars, in our homes, in our offices. And about half of the air pollution that we inhale in these places has nothing to do with whether we have, outdoor air pollution, but rather it's because we are producing it in our homes and not just through the things that, you might expect, like if you're charbroiling a steak on the oven, but rather through things that many people perceive as healthy, like burning incense, using scented candles, spraying air fresheners. And so the opportunity here is tremendous because these are things that we can opt out of, that we can make healthier choices around. And long term, we know that these are things that have a massive positive benefit on our brain health when we start making some of these small changes.
Just to recap what you said about air pollution, number one, what's invisible is typically ignored because if people can't see it, it doesn't exist. Not true. Number two, really to highlight what you said, air pollution occurs mostly indoors. It's kind of like the idea that we're most commonly going to have an accident within 5 miles of our house. And many wellness products increase indoor air pollution. People think they're doing something well and they're not. But there's a specific particle size that you've made a major point on that I'd really like you to take into some detail so everybody knows about it.
Absolutely. Air pollution is made up of several different components. So there can be toxic gases like nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, ozone gas. There are volatile organic compounds, things that are found in scented products. There are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. But the best studied air pollutant that relates to worse health outcomes, and in particular, worse brain health outcomes, is particulate matter or PMs. And particulate matter is so problematic because these are tiny particles produced by things that we may not be worried about whatsoever. And when I say tiny particles, a human hair is about 70 microns in size. These tiny particles can be, at the order of nanometers. So we're talking about these incredibly small particles. Generally speaking, when we think about particulate matter, again, the best studied air pollutant that relates to worse health outcomes, you can categorize it based on whether it's 10 microns or larger, so PM10s or larger, or 2.5 microns or smaller. Why that matters is not just because you get to talk about microns and talk about these tiny measurements,
Great.
but because the larger particles, so PM10s or larger, actually can get stuck in your mucociliary tree, in your respiratory tree. So you're able to clear them. They don't necessarily get deep into your body. They may get stuck in your lungs, but you're able to keep them from getting deep into your system. With one correlate here being that when you kick these things up in your mucociliary tree, and then you clear your throat or you cough, and then you swallow that, you're actually inoculating your microbiome with air pollution, which helps to explain why microbiomes of people exposed to higher levels of air pollution are different than people exposed to lower levels of air pollution. The gut microbiome, in particular, because we wind up actually swallowing many of these particles. But the more concerning particles as it relates to especially brain health is the PM 2.5s or below. And the reason for this is these molecules or these particles are small enough that they can penetrate through our alveoli, which are our respiratory cells, get into the bloodstream, and induce these effects throughout the body. Specifically, what they do is they increase oxidative stress and they amp up inflammatory pathways. And so, the smaller the particles, the more concerning they are. And anything under 2.5 microns is most concerning as it relates to what is creating higher rates of brain health problems.
So we breathe it in. It can get to our gut. 80% of our immune cells are in our gut. It can damage our gut, which communicates in a millisecond with our brain. BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factors, as you mentioned, come from our gut. It's a protein enzyme that go to our brain that provide that idea of miracle grow, your brain neurogenesis, and neuroplasticity. So people have to understand that the body's all interconnected and the immune system rules. That said, I have said that the key to longevity is turning on house switches. The master switch is having a robust, resilient immune system. How do you correlate the immune system with longevity going forward?
Mm. All right, we're going to draw some lines between things here. First is to say air pollution is a potent activator of the immune system, in particular, inflammation. And they've actually done studies where they look at the macrophages in various parts of the body. So in the lungs, they're activated by air pollution. In the brain, microglial cells, again, the macrophages in the brain, they have shown, looking at dogs, looking at humans, people living in places with higher levels of air pollution have more activated microglial cells. So that's a problem, that air pollution increases inflammation within the brain and in the body. Then let's transition that into how does that relate to longevity and what do we do about all of this, right? Because it's one thing to talk about everything going wrong. We should also be focused on what we can do to make things go right. So, briefly, as it relates to the longevity and inflammation correlation, obviously, I would recommend your book on this topic. You did a great job with this. But the drivers of aging throughout the body, one of the principal drivers is something called inflammaging or immunosenescence, basically the aging of the immune system and the programming of the immune system towards a state of chronic inflammation seems to more rapidly age both the tissue in which the immune cell is located and systemically age the body. So our goal is to decrease exposure within our bodies to chronic inflammation, and in doing so, to help shield the body against the effects on longevity and in health span. Now, in thinking about this a lot, I would look at inflammation within the body, within the brain, not so much as this, negative thing that the body does randomly, but as a response to a danger signal. Inflammation is really the body responding to a perceived danger signal. And it makes total sense from an adaptive perspective. If our body is being posed with a threat, whether that's bacterium or an air pollutant, which, by the way, air pollution can include molecules like lipopolysaccharide, a potent bacterial immune stimuli. But when our bodies are being faced with any sort of a potential danger signal, and again, the air we breathe, the food that we eat, dysbiosis in our gut, stressful content coming in through our eyes and our ears, it activates inflammation because inflammation helps to rally the body's defense system to kill off whatever that threat may be. And so there are a lot of people focusing on, okay, so inflammation's happening in the body. We just need to go after the inflammation and suppress it. That's what most conventional medicines to this end would do. I'm a fan of, at certain times taking a nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory over the counter. That's great. It helps to decrease inflammation. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about why inflammation is happening and why our body is perceiving that danger signal. So if we were to take this a step back and say, what can we do by looking at the most important drivers of inflammation in our bodies and in particular within our brains to decrease our body's exposure to this danger signal so that we're not always programming ourselves towards inflammation while simultaneously bringing in anti-inflammatory signals. We can go across the spectrum of all of these different interventions that I spoke to you about, or all the different drivers of kind of brain aging and inflammation, and make some pretty significant headroads into or inroads into finding solutions. So let's just go through these very quickly. I know we won't be able to cover all of these in depth, but I want to talk about diet. We'll talk a little bit about air. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other variables. When it comes to diet, everyone has their own perspective on what is ideal, what a person should do for brain health, what a person should do for heart health. As it relates to brain longevity, I'll just kind of run through my top tips. One, prioritize a minimally processed diet similar to a Mediterranean pattern diet or a mind pattern diet. You can look these up. They're generally just a minimally processed diet with some healthy fats, high in fiber. But some of the correlates to those diets, one would be prioritization of polyphenol-rich foods. Polyphenols are nutrients found in plants. Generally speaking, I think shooting for around 2,000 milligrams of polyphenols a day in our foods is a reasonable goal. I think reduction of ultra-processed food, especially anything with added sugar, should be a top goal for everyone. For omega-3s, a gram a day of EPA and DHA seem like they're best studied to be valuable for protecting brain longevity. And then there are certain nutrients like choline, lutein, zeaxanthin found in foods like egg yolks that I think are worthy of additional consideration. Leafy greens, kale, spinach, collard greens all have been studied to be beneficial to brain aging. And then dietary fiber, as I mentioned before, correlated with better brain health, better longevity. The goal would be around 34 grams a day, a little bit less if you're a woman, usually because they base recommendations on how many calories you're consuming. Most people consume roughly half of the goal dietary fiber content per day. One other thing that I've been talking about a lot, and I know that you've talked about as well, is creatine, specifically creatine monohydrate. As it stands right now, we're in 2025. The research may change. Some people are pushing for a 10 gram a day dose for brain health based on some brain bioavailability data. The majority of the data suggests that it's 5 grams, but
Mhm.
usually what we're talking about here is actual creatine monohydrate supplementation and not just taking it in the context of eating a healthy diet. And this may be especially helpful if a person is a vegan or otherwise not getting much creatine from their diet because it is an animal-based, usually an animal-based source that people would get it from. And then last kind of tip on this front for supplementation or for diet, I do think magnesium is very important. So there are different types, but usually what you're shooting for is at least 350 milligrams a day. And there are some data showing that magnesium, specifically from a dietary perspective, is correlated with better brain health outcomes. So that's my really quick take on some of the dietary considerations. Does that all make sense, or do you think there's some things there that aren't quite in line with what you would think reasonable?
I think they all make sense, and I think we should be specific. A lot of the polyphenols that we're both nodding our head about come from Tartary buckwheat. You wrote an article that was published in 2024 in Frontiers. Congrats, great periodical that spoke about polyphenols and how polyphenols imbue your immune system to reach new levels. So if you could give a little overview on that, I mean, I think that's a breakthrough. It's a food. It's
Yeah.
gluten-free. It's great protein.
Yeah, so let's talk about that briefly. Polyphenols are a subset of nutrients. Technically, they're non-caloric, so they're not exactly nutrients, but they're plant chemicals found in plants that provide plants with immune benefits. And when we consume polyphenols, they actually influence our own immune system and they program our microbiome towards a generally more healthy state. We wanted to do a test on specifically what do polyphenols from a plant called Himalayan tartary buckwheat do to humans' immune systems. And so we published this, as you alluded to, last year, looking at a dose of polyphenols that included rutin, quercetin, luteolin, and asparagine. It's kind of a subset of flavonols that are linked to improve longevity. And so these molecules we found in humans consuming these for 90 days was correlated with dramatic changes in longevity related pathways. And we actually saw for the first time that for people who were aging more rapidly, there was a 47% slower rate of aging using
Wow.
some of these age clock algorithms that we probably won't get into in too much detail right now, but that are able to decipher from a person's blood set their speed of aging using complex algorithms. So polyphenols, really interesting, we could talk about for a while, but this is a set of nutrients that have been, or plant chemicals that have been historically consumed at much higher levels, but have been largely stripped out of the American diet in favor of things like white bread and white rice. And so our goal here is to help people to understand why it's reasonable and important for us to start reintroducing them into the diet and why we need to get over some of these concerns we've had about every food needing to be sweet or otherwise flavorless, as opposed to the way that real food tastes, which sometimes is a little bit bitter, has these different flavors. That actually comes from polyphenols in our diet. So polyphenols are fascinating, and I do think, generally speaking, consuming more polyphenols, especially those that have been more correlated with longevity, is a great bet.
I'm going to piggyback on what you said and give a small litany on polyphenols. I wrote a list for you. They improved heart health, blood sugar metabolism, high antioxidants. This is specifically from tartary buckwheat. Great for gut health, as you said. They're great for immune function. They also help there because they're so nutrient rich. I think that we're eating so many foods that are nutrient poor, that ultra processed idea. Gluten free, good for weight management, and anti-inflammatory effects, because didn't you say that inflammation may be the look behind the curtain for the problem with longevity? I mean, isn't that the key for the people who are living to be centenarians, that they have a specific strength in their immune system? They have the ability, and I'm setting you up on a beautiful tee here. So here comes the softball for immune rejuvenation, i.e., immunocompetency.
Right. And I know that you've written about this research as well, but when you look at the immune systems of people who live to 100 years old, what you find is that these are people with more resilient immune systems. And conversely, when you look at alterations in the immune system that correlate with dying early and having more health-related issues, what you find is that the immune system becomes programmed towards a state of relative inflammation. And so this has been a fundamental area of research that we're looking at Big Bold Health, trying to help people to understand what they can do to reverse this immune aging process that underlies so much of what is going wrong right now. And so polyphenols are a key part of this, because what we're seeing here is that these nutrients can actually help to program the immune system towards a state of relative balance. And so this is research published by several different groups around the world, and we've been able to start contributing to that with our publication last year. We're doing more research on this topic right now with a large study that we're very excited about. But it all kind of stems from this idea that if you look at the blue zones, if you look at people who live long, healthy lives, what are they doing? Well, they're eating real food. They're making movement part of their day. They're in community with other people. They're living in places where healthy behaviors are the norm. And while it's easy to go to a place of saying, I want to maintain my Western society view of working insanely hard each day and watching a ton of TV and basically doing all these things that we take for granted as normal, and then do a quick fix intervention that's supposed to keep us alive longer. The reality is the closer we can get to what our ancestors did, the better. And so our goal here is we're working with several foods, but primarily with this Himalayan tartary buckwheat. We're trying to find ways to make the wisdom of this, multi-thousand-year-old, historically consumed plant for medicinal reasons, making that available to people both through the peer-reviewed research and also through products that allow them to consume these nutrients and make it a part of their day, whether it's a food or the one that I use more of, which is a sprouted food. It's basically, we take the seeds from this plant, we sprout them to enhance their polyphenol content, and then it's just really easy to add to whatever else you're eating. But it still remains a food. It is a functional food that's very high in polyphenols, and finding those ways to connect the dots. So it's not saying you have to change every part of your life, but you are able to get close to or closer to what our ancestors have historically done for health. I think that's a good thing.
Spoiler alert, I use the tartary buckwheat for pancakes. I have that recipe in my book. And in addition, I speak all the time about, I love it, immune rejuvenation, the breakdown of old immune cells, using lifestyle to enrich and make new immune cells to allow them to be immunoresilient. I'm a basketball guy, so that means the defensive guy has that flexibility to variance. And I really love the concept of immunocompetency because it's the ability of the organ's immune system to effectively recognize and respond to foreign antigens. And lastly, really a real big takeaway that you had, I think you just thumbed over it, but I mean, highlight, put it on the movie screen, was the balance of the immune system. It's not immune system dysfunction, it's immune system imbalance.
Yeah, that's 100% right. One of the most popular myths that I see right now is this idea of saying you can just tweak something, fix your immune system, and everything's good to go. And it's like saying the immune system is an elevator and it either goes up or down, but the reality is it's a three-dimensional system. I guess four-dimensional if you think about it through time. And so my goal or our goal should not be to boost the immune system overnight with some vitamin C and call it a day, as though
Mm,
now we're going to have a defense against the cold and we should be good to go. The reality is that your immune system is a principal system that allows you to interact with the world and maintain resilience against all the things that life throws at you. And so the immune system in the brain helps you to maintain resilience against mental health issues and Alzheimer's disease. Immune system in the gut is key to whether you develop metabolic diseases.
mm.
Immune system in your fat cells helps determine whether your fat is going to, number one, grow and become unhealthy, but also whether your fat is going to be linked to disease or if it's going to be relatively just storage space in case you need some of that extra fuel. And so our goal is to teach the immune system how to exist in a state of balance where it's able to fend off problems that come up, but also to protect and sustain health along our lifespan. And so, what do you do about that? Well, you teach the immune system how to become more resilient, how to become more balanced. You do that through a couple of key ways, right? You eat foods that program your microbiome towards a state of health. Microbiome talks to the immune system in the gut perpetually. You're going to be consuming content that helps to keep your immune system in a state of balance. If you think you can watch the news at 10 p.m. and watch something crazy happening across the world that's super stressful and it doesn't change your immune system, you're wrong. And so we've got to think about what we consume through our eyes, through our ears, that is teaching our immune system to be balanced or out of whack. And then also, as I mentioned here, we have these other surfaces. So I'm very focused on the air because the air
Mm.
can come in and influence our immune system locally in our lungs and then systemically through these tiny particles that get into our bloodstream and change our brains. But we also have to think about our skin, right? Our skin, this massive surface with what we put on it influencing our immune system locally at the level of the skin and potentially systemically. So, not to take people to a place of saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to panic. It's very straightforward to make some simple changes to keep your immune system in balance. What does that mean? Think about what you consume, what you're consuming through your eyes and your ears. Is it inflammatory, stressful content? Use the idea of becoming informed or educated, but at some point it becomes less education and just getting upset. That is an immune stimuli that we want to try to avoid. Similarly, are we consuming foods that program our immune system towards a state of balance, minimally processed foods, healthy fats, polyphenols, omega 3s? Or are we consuming junk that is teaching our immune system to take on a state of inflammation because it's saying, this is a threat. I need to fend off this threat. And then when it comes to our air, are we breathing in molecules that support our health? Or are we breathing in polluted air that is going to rev up our immune system? And just very briefly, incense in the home, scented candles in the home, air fresheners in the home, and certainly if you're cooking anything that is generating smoke, these are major inflammatory threats. So be careful with that. Specifically, if you see smoke in your house, whether that's coming from somebody's cigarette or from your stovetop or from your incense or from your candle, that is a direct inflammatory threat to your body and to your brain. So it doesn't mean you can't ever have a candle in your home again. But I think just like you would probably not eat donuts 3 times a day, you've got to realize that these are things that in moderation may be okay, but you want to try to mitigate the long-term effects on your immune system.
Would you call what you described immune programming or immune reprogramming?
Absolutely.
All right, so to recap, muscle's important, It's the longevity organ. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon said that. Mark Hyman calls it the currency of longevity. Air quality, that is without question something that you made quite important. Chronic infections, chronic stress, inflammation. Time Magazine put inflammation on the cover 20 years ago. Now they're talking about inflammation. We want to manage and modulate inflammation. Microbiome changes, genetic, epigenetic alterations, and maybe mitochondrial dysfunction. So you like all that.
All the things, but it all comes down to what can you do about it right now. And so I'd say if any of the options here sounded interesting to a person, pick one, right? You don't have to change everything about your life overnight. And I really hate it when it's saying, oh, if you don't do everything, then you shouldn't even try. Go for a walk, lift some weights, go out into nature where you breathe some healthy air, or maybe just don't burn that incense today. Make a healthy meal, cut back on your Instagram content. These are all amazing ways to start that basically feed forward cycle. And the one that we didn't really get into in very much detail, but is also accurate, is the sleep, because sleep helps to program your immune system within your body and your brain. So these are all great scenarios where you can start to make inroads towards getting your brain and body on your side towards a state of immune balance and rejuvenation. It doesn't have to be if you don't eat this many grams of protein, you shouldn't even try. What we're talking about here are simple, sustainable steps towards health.
I'm always end by asking, can you give the one thing? I have my friend, he's an Oxford grad, he's in Geneva, and he says, Rob, have the particular guest give me one thing that I can chew on, land the plane. And I don't know if I'm going to get the one thing, but I'm going to push it a little bit just for him.
If there's one thing that I think is going to be revolutionary in terms of people using it to support their health, it is stop generating brain damaging pollutants inside of your health or inside of your house. We are we can all get on board with the idea that if you eat junk food, you're making a mistake, or that if you don't exercise, you realize it's not the best thing for your health. But if you are purposely spraying air fresheners or using incense in your home under the guise of something wellness related, recognize that you are doing the exact opposite of what you think as it relates to your health. And the research here is compelling. You can see long-term cognitive impairments. We can see short-term cognitive impairments. We can see risks for a host of issues. By the way, obesity, metabolic dysfunction is related to these air pollutants. So I would say the thing that I would recommend people consider here is, especially if you're already doing good stuff for your food, you're already exercising, pay attention to your sleep, look at what you are putting into your indoor air, because there is no avoiding it. If you're living in this home or in this car and you have the air freshener or you have the smoke, you are breathing it in and it is damaging your immune system and your health.
So everybody's going to ask, so we might as well give them the answer. Where can they get a quality air freshener? We'll put it in the show notes as well.
So yes, I do. Well, I have created a company specific to education around indoor air. We do have an air purifier. It's a HEPA 14 air purifier called the Lichen Air that we built specifically to target these brain damaging PM 2.5s. But you don't have to go to that. There are so many different ways that you can approach this topic. And so much of this is simply cutting back on the things that damage your indoor air, opening your windows, being conscious of what you're creating. So if a person is interested in taking that next step, we have lichenair.com. They can learn about that air purifier and also a bunch of articles I've written on the topic of how to improve your indoor air. But my hope again is not that you go out and buy this air purifier, but rather that you just start taking steps to improve your indoor air.
Fantastic. Listen, this has been a great 55 minutes. I really appreciate your time. Dr. Austin Perlmutter, the rocket ship man in health and functional medicine. Roll with it. Thanks so much for your time.